I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. Along with the sunshine, there's got to be a little rain sometime. Those of you who are chuckling are probably my age or older. You recognize the words of Lynn Anderson from 1970. That song was actually made into a rap song not too long ago, believe it or not. But the words are true still. We all have a little rain in our lives from time to time, don't we? We all encounter difficulties. Even those who are truly devoted to God have rough patches in their life. Adoniram Judson, who was a missionary to Burma in 1812, one of the most faithful people that ever lived, wrote to his fiance's father. Her name was Anne Hasseltine. He wrote to the father to ask for consent to marry Anne. And this is what he wrote, because he was going to go on the missionary field. He wrote, "Do I have your consent to take Anne and you will never see her again in this world? Do I have your consent to take her on the missionary field where she will have hardships of the missionary life? Do I have your consent to take her across the ocean where the ship might sink and we might drown? Do I have your consent to take her to southern India where the climate is not like it is here, where we might contract a fatal disease? Do I have your consent to take her where there's want and distress and degradation and insult and persecution, where she might die a violent death? Do I have your consent? All for the hope of glory, for the crown of righteousness, for the praise of Christ our Savior." Would you have given consent for your daughter? I think I would have had to think about that. But all of this for God's kingdom. Today is All Saints' Day, and we celebrate the lives of those who have gone before us, who showed us how to live through life's ups and downs and to rely totally upon Christ. We grieve their departure from this world, but we also celebrate with hope that we will one day see them. That when God's kingdom comes in its fullness, we will be reunited with these whom we love. This is a time where we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. When we walk through those times of grief. As we read through the names earlier, I thought of my own father who died this year. And those tinges of grief come upon us and hit us all from time to time. And yet I remember his example in life to continue on with life and to live your life to its fullest until God calls you home. To follow the Good Shepherd even through those valleys of the shadow of death. When we think about following Christ, the Good Shepherd, we realize that from time to time, he is going to call us through some difficulties. Think about a shepherd and their sheep. They can only let them graze in one place for so long, they will eat the grass up. And so from time to time, they will have to call to the sheep, and they will have to take them across dangerous territory that they might find better pastures. Yes, there are dangers, but there's also a shepherd. When the children of Israel were wandering in the desert, where were they trying to go? To the promised land, the place that the place that God had called them unto. And because God was ahead of them and God was calling to them, they had nothing to fear. And when God calls us, even through those difficult times of life, we too do not need to be afraid. As Jesus said in Luke 12, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for the Father has pleased to give you the kingdom." We are traveling on to a better place, and yet life has these dangers along the path. We do have fears, but we can trust the Savior. In fact, I would say that we probably learn to trust God more in the difficult times of our life than those times of great blessing. None of us want hard days, But when they come, don't waste them. If you are going through pain, lean in to God. Learn in those difficult times. Grow in your relationship with God. Focus not on the pain, but focus on the shepherd. Maybe you've heard the old African parable that's called Run Toward the Roar. Have you heard of that? Run Toward the Roar. It's about the lions and the way they hunt. The old male lion, when he gets so old that he can't really do much but still roar, they will send him to one end, the pack will, and they will go around to the other side of the herd they are trying to get. It's really the lionesses that are the danger. They are the hunters. And the old lion, he will roar, and everyone will scatter, waiting for the ambush. But when you talk about running towards the roar, that proverb means that you turn and go towards what you're afraid of. But isn't that difficult? Isn't it difficult to run towards that danger? But if that is the way that God is leading you, even through the valley of the shadow of death, that is actually the safest path to go to where the pain might be. Levi and Jenny Lesko live out in Montana. He is the pastor of Fresh Life Church. He's also a part of the Billy Graham Evangelical Association. The Leskos tragically lost their daughter, Lena. When they got home from the hospital, they wanted to hide. They didn't want to be around their church folks. They didn't want anybody around. They just wanted to pretend that it did not happen. And yet they prayed and they made a decision that they would embrace this pain and they would learn to trust God through it. Did that make it all easy? Absolutely not. And yet it got them through. One day, a nurse brought over a box from the hospital. It was the things that Lena had with her the night that she died. The Leskos say that as they opened that they poured out their grief. It was as if a fire was in their skin. And they cried out and they grieved and they thought that they would be destroyed, but they cried together and they began to cry out to God until God gave them the strength to stand again. And then their prayer turned from that prayer of grief and desperation to a prayer of reliance, to a prayer for those who had been in that hospital that night who had helped them, to a prayer that those who were still struggling and suffering might have their prayers answered. Though they did not feel that they could survive it, they realized that God was with them. That though they were walking through this valley of the shadow of death, they were not alone. As Sherry continues to paint for us, she is painting the valley of the shadow of death. If you're wondering where the actual valley of the shadow of death is, it is in Israel. It is a valley that leads down from Jerusalem to Jericho. We know it from the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is a place where people feared to go because as they went through it, it was a dark place. It is a deep rut. It is a deep valley, and the sunshine has a hard time getting down there, and it is where people are often attacked. It is a dangerous place, and you need to be careful when you go through there. But the psalmist says, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." What is a rod and a staff used for by a shepherd? Well, of course, it's used to perhaps take a sheep that's fallen into a ditch and to pull it out. That's one thing it's used for. But it's also used to block the sheep from going the wrong way, to poke them a little bit if need be. It's to provide those boundaries so that they might be able to stay on the right path. When we go through difficult times, we are in danger. not just from what is around us, but from ourselves. Sometimes we fall into difficulties, sometimes we create them. When we are hurting, we are tempted. Our anger and our resentment can get the best of us. And when the psalmist says, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me, it's partly because that rod and that staff is used to fight off the lions and whatnot, but it's also something that guides us and helps us stay in bounds. Children know that they need rules. They know it innately. They push for those boundaries, right? They want us to set those for them, that they might know that everything's all right, that someone's looking out and keeping them out of the ditches. I've told you about a friend of mine that's a children's minister that had an after-school program, and one day he decided he would just let the kids go and play and do whatever they want. And they came in and said, what game are we playing today? And he said, we're playing whatever game you want. I'm just going to stand over here, and there are no rules. And they said, yay! And they went out and they started trying to organize themselves, and guess what happened? A fight ensued. Arguments erupted. And they kept coming back and saying, they're not doing right. And he said, there's no rules. How can they not be doing right? And they kept asking and asking, please help us play a game. Give us some boundaries in life. When I was a teenager, I had an agreement with my parents. I made the same agreement with my kids, and you may have it with your kids. That was that you could always use your parents for an out. If there's something I didn't want to do, I could say, my mom and dad won't let me. I'd really like to, but they just won't. My kids could do the same thing at any time. They could say, well, I'd like to go to that party, but I'd get in trouble. I can't do that. Because we all need someone to help us to know where the boundaries are. That is why when the children of Israel were in the desert and they were wandering, God said, let me give you some rules for life. And he said, I am the Lord thy God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet. These are the commandments that God gave us, those parameters to stay in. And yet the people broke. They broke those commandments. They broke through those guardrails. And so God would send the prophets, as Micah said, and what does the Lord God require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. It's not that difficult. Just give your lives to God and treat others right. That's why when Jesus was asked what is the greatest commandment, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and the greatest of the commandments. And the second is likened to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And Jesus knew we had a hard time remembering 10. He said, just get these two right. Just love God with everything you have and love others. And you will fulfill those commandments. Stay in bounds. But there's another thing we need to know. When we walk through those difficult times, we need to be careful not to get stuck in them. We must keep on. God is leading us through, not to problems. When the shepherd would have to move the sheep, he was trying to get them somewhere, not just leave them out in the desert. He would be on guard through those difficult times, but they were going somewhere. Some of you have been enjoying the construction on I-40. Valerie drives through it most every day of the week, and she comes in every week just very, very frustrated with it. I keep saying, but honey, when it's done, it's going to be such a nice highway. She said, well, let's get it done. It's difficult. But sometimes we do seem like it just doesn't go anywhere, like it's gotten stuck. The trouble is, sometimes we're like that We get stuck, we get stopped in those shadowy times. You see, the sheep, they need to keep moving through the danger. Stopping's the worst thing they can do. It's one that stops and gets left behind that gets eaten by the lion. We've got to keep listening to the voice of the shepherd that's saying, come on, keep moving. I know this is hard, but keep going. When I first moved to North Carolina, a friend of mine, Ed, said, I want you to go hiking with me. I said, that sounds great. And we went up to Grandfather Mountain, and I was from Georgia. And Georgia, when we go hiking, is flat. It's really nice. I didn't realize we're going to be hiking up and down mountains and there'd be ladders and stuff like that to climb up. And I got out there and I got winded and I got tired and it was in the winter and it was cold and I just sat down. Ed said, Nelson, don't sit down right there. I said, I'm tired. I got to sit down. He said, well, you're sitting in a shadow right now. And your muscles are going to cramp and lock up and you're going to have a hard time getting up and moving. You're sitting also really close to the edge, and you might fall off if you're not very careful. We got to keep moving. And I promise you, 5 minutes from here, there is a beautiful view. Get up and keep moving. And we did. And we climbed up on top of a rock, and the sunshine warmed us, and there was a beautiful view of the valley just like he promised. But if I'd gotten stuck back there, I might still be there today. But that's what we do. In our grief, in our troubles, we sometimes get stuck there. And God says, keep coming, keep coming. There are better days ahead. God will lead, but we must move. Some of you enjoy boating, and most of you know that if you're going to steer a boat, it needs to be moving, right? It's got to have something that helps it get through the water. Most of you have ridden a bike, right? Have you ever tried to just sit on one stationary? Doesn't work very well, does it? A bike works when it is moving. Then you can balance. Then you can steer it. God says, I will be with you through these shadowy, dark days, but you can't stop. You've got to keep moving. You've got to maintain that balance, and I will always be present with you. Some years ago, a church I was in had a ministry where some ladies knitted prayer shawls. Maybe you've seen those. They're these beautiful knitted blankets, and as they would knit, with each stitch, they would pray that the person that was going to receive that might know of God's grace in healing. When they'd get one finished, they'd come knock on my office door and say, we've got a prayer shawl finished, come in and pray over it. And I'd come in and I would pray for that finished shawl. And they would write a note. And the note said this: wrap this shawl around you and remember that you are wrapped in the prayers of your church and God's wonderful grace. It was really sweet, and I enjoyed talking to the ladies, and I thought it was a good ministry, and I enjoyed going in and having the prayer with them, but I always thought, well, I don't know really how meaningful these things are. And then I got a diagnosis of thyroid cancer. I went to the hospital to have surgery to have my thyroid removed, and I was sitting there waiting for the surgery, and if you've ever been in a hospital waiting for surgery, you know exactly how that feels. It's an anxious time. It feels out of control. And in walked Harriet, who led this ministry. She had a beautiful purple prayer shawl. She said, Pastor, this past week we all worked on this one. We prayed over every stitch. And she wrapped it around my shoulders and said, remember, you are wrapped in our prayers and the grace of God. It was such a tangible, wonderful moment. I could feel God's presence through the ladies' work. I hope that as you walk through your valleys of the shadow of death, that you have no fear, for God is with you, comforting you and keeping you.